Okay, I think I got it. Hopefully I didn't break it. Or delete the one that we just recorded. We'll see. So that kind of gives you a sense of the work of God versus the work of Satan. I think it's important to notice how the will of God is sometimes to confront evil. That the will of God isn't always not to say anything or to hide. That sometimes it is to confront what is wrong, or to state clearly what is true, to state clearly what a good direction is. Paul has that experience, and that's important. So then he leaves from Paphos and he goes to Perga. Now that should help you suspect that Paphos is also a port city, in this case on the western end of the island of Cyprus, and he goes to Perga, which is in the region of Pamphylia. I'm sure you knew that like the back of your hand. If you look on the map that's back a page, on page 91, you can see the region of Pamphylia, and then the region of Pisidia, where he's going next. Cilicia is the province where Tarsus is, and Tarsus is probably on there because that's where Paul is from. And then you can see where Cappadocia and Phrygia are as well. These names come out all over the New Testament. And so that's one of the reasons that I think it's important to see it a little bit and to at least become familiar, having seen it once, that this is a little bit of where they are. So Perga is on the Turkish coast. It's 150 miles, so this is probably 2 or 2.5 days at sea. Again, part of me wonders, what did they do? You know, you're in a boat, there aren't a lot of extra things. It's one of the reasons why they sat there and lots of people composed poetry or wrote. In later history, you'll find people writing while they're on a ship because there aren't a lot of other things to do. They probably didn't fish very much. One table mentioned that, but they probably didn't fish very much because they're sailing, and you'd be sailing away from your fish. You know, like usually when you're fishing, you're moving relatively slowly, and in this case, they don't want to move slowly, they want to move fast. Sometimes I think sailing could be very frustrating. I don't know if it was as big of a deal in this part of the world, but have you heard of the doldrums? The doldrums are this area around the equator where there's not a lot of wind. And so there were times where vessels get stuck for months later in the age of exploration because the wind doesn't blow. And it's kind of worthless to sit on your boat watching the sails just sort of hang down. So they arrive in Paphos, or they arrive in Perga, and Mark leaves them. And this is an interesting part because Paul is going to get a bit upset with him about this. But they've very likely already been on this journey for months. They could be 4 or 5 months, maybe even longer into the journey. It notes that they had traveled all around Cyprus and they end up in Paphos. They had been preaching in the synagogues on the Sabbath, but there's a huge amount of time that's taking place. This whole journey likely takes around 2 years. You know, most of you have not thought of going on a 2-year-long vacation. And in this case, it isn't a vacation. And you can feel that there's a lot of life that's happening that isn't related in the scriptures. It hasn't described any of their meals, hasn't described any of their sleeping arrangements. they didn't sort of turn into statues every night and then wake up in the morning. They had to have somewhere to stay and somewhere to eat, some people that they were with. They traveled to Pisidian Antioch. This is the same name as Antioch in Syria, but this is a different one. This is Antioch in Turkey. And this Antioch is in the Turkish highlands. It's part of the Turkish plateau that is away from the coast. It's 100 miles to the north of Perga.
So there's 2 Antiochs.
Oh no, there's like 13. Antioch was named for, there was a line of kings of the Seleucid dynasty that took the name Antiochus. And so Antioch was named for Antiochus. Just like there's a whole bunch of Caesareas, and Caesarea was named for Caesar. It's not actually all that different from cities in North Dakota, that you find all kinds of city names that are repeated and repeated and repeated wherever a certain group of people settled. And it kind of is where they were from in Germany or in Russia. So they named places in Russia the same as they left in Germany, and then when they got here, they named them the same as they were in Russia. Sometimes they added new in front of it, like New Prague, New Leipzig. They did that a few times. Even New York. York is the name of a city in England, and New York is in the United States. So they repeated names quite frequently, and that happens a lot even in the modern world. This is an important Roman city. This is probably the provincial capital, and it's on a Roman road that was paved with stones. And this road, I should have written down what it was called. The city was about 800 meters by 1,000 meters, which means this is quite a large city. This isn't just a tiny thing. And this picture is from that road. The road you can see kind of in the middle of the picture and toward the bottom right. That's, even today, the ruins of this Roman road are still there. The Romans were exceptional builders and engineers. They weren't as good at some other things, but they were exceptional engineers. Roman cement, I think, weathers better than the cement we use now. They were rather intelligent, although it sounds like one of the secret ingredients to Roman cement that took them a long time to figure out is one of the most plentiful things in the world. Seawater. And they couldn't imagine, modern engineers couldn't imagine why they used seawater in their cement, but they did. And so it notes that this gives you a little bit of a feel of the region too. You can see that it's not as easy to see without the color, but in the center of that picture is a modern day city or a bunch of buildings. So these hills around it are probably several thousand feet high. It's not just a little bit. The land goes up and down a lot more than we are used to here in this region. And they go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. That tells us, if there's a synagogue, that there's a Jewish community. There's a Jewish community that's worshiping at a synagogue. There were other temples in the area. It only notes this Sabbath day. There's other times. There's a bigger expanded thing here. And if you've been on a trip, a long trip, like if you're taking a long car trip, what starts to happen on it? What takes place? Boredom is one. Smelly horses is probably another one if you're traveling in the ancient world. What else? Tired. Yeah. Frustrations, obstacles. It's not easy to travel with people even in the modern world. Sometimes things take longer than you intend. If you want exercises and frustration, going to airports in major cities and waiting in line for hours, I'm sure is on the top of your list to do. And then you get to the front and you get some cranky security person who is like, makes you like take apart your bag and do this and do that, and in the end it's like, yeah, whatever, okay, you're fine, move on. What was that for? But if you think of this, like Paul and Barnabas have likely been on this journey maybe for 6 months, 8 months. By this point they've been traveling, they've been staying. You wonder a little bit if there's some places where they were really glad to get rid of them. Sometimes you have family members come and they can stay for a few days, and at the end of it you love them a lot and you also are ready for them to leave. Because they're in your space and they're not as clean and they don't do things the way you want them to, and those kind of things. But, it's so easy for us to decide, well, things must be different for apostles. And it would, if it was like St. Paul, well, St. Paul could stay at my house for, 10 years if he wanted to. But, what if he got up at 5 in the morning and started preaching? Like, okay, you can't preach inside, go outside. Be with the roosters. But it's important to think about this because there's a vast experience of life behind this. Sometimes we look at it like John Mark left Paul and Barnabas. Oh, he shouldn't have done that, and that was bad. But there's a whole bunch of people that if I was traveling with them for a week, I'd be like, we'll meet back in Fargo. See you later. And, that could have happened. There could have been frustrations. Just because they're apostles doesn't mean that everything always worked. Sometimes when you listen to the narration of Paul's life later in his letters, it actually sounds rather horrible. He gets beaten and charged and chased out of towns and shipwrecked and bitten by snakes and on and on and on. It's like, I don't even want to travel with you. Everything goes wrong when you come. You come along and everything that was supposed to happen doesn't work. And the synagogue official invites them, if you have a word for us, brothers, share it. If you have a word to speak, share it. Now, this, I think, is kind of odd, because if you were at a modern day church, I suppose anywhere in the United States, more or less, unless you were in a really small town, you would be surprised if the priest noticed you or the pastor noticed you. I mean, sometimes they ask for visitors. Sometimes people know, oh, we haven't seen you before. But in lots of cases, if you went to church in New York, would anyone come up and talk to you? Probably not. So it's very possible that their way of clothing, that their way of dress was particular or unique. It's very possible that they were given away by an accent. They're likely speaking in Greek here. This is Greek country. Greek gods, Greek culture, olive oil, wine, that kind of thing. In Israel, they probably spoke in Aramaic, mostly. In Antioch, they would have spoken in Aramaic. But here, it's probably Greek, and it would be Greek on Cyprus as well. And so, in some way, they're given away. It's just, they know that they're you ain't from here. And they're invited to preach at the synagogue service. There must have been a bit more flexibility and a bit more, synagogue services were more open, that any man who was there was allowed to speak to the congregation. And this, to me, sounds a little bit like this synagogue official doesn't quite know what he's in for. Like, well, if anyone has a word to speak. Sometimes this happens when you do a funeral service or a vigil service especially, and people share memories. And most people are pretty good. I had one funeral vigil where the first person got up and they spoke for 40 minutes. So that one I actually left. I had told them that I had somewhere to be at a certain time, and I left. And I met the funeral people at the church the next day, and they said that went on for 2.5 more hours. It started at 7, and I think they didn't leave until 10:30. I was like, yeah, I kind of was suspicious. But there's another possibility here that's the case, that the synagogue official asks Paul to speak because he knew who he was. He's already heard him. They were very likely there for more than just Sunday because, again, it's the ancient world, and you don't just sort of show up and then disappear and drive hundreds of miles later. Some people do that today where they'll show up at a small town and you're like, why are you here? Oh, we're just passing through. You know, we're on our way home from Billings and oh, okay. You know, we don't think too much of driving several hundred miles. In the ancient world, that could be a journey of a week. So one possibility is that the synagogue official had already been listening to Paul and Barnabas. Another possibility is that he didn't know what he was in for. But I think this is a good place to stop for this week, and then next week we can get into Paul's speech. So you're lucky. You get to answer the rest of the questions next week. Thank you again to Vicki for bringing the cake and the muffins, I think. If anyone wants a cup of tea for the road, I don't know if a lot of those got drank before, but I made some black. One of them is an apricot black tea, and one of them is, I don't know what the other one is. It was good. I had the other one. Oh, and Helen has on Friday,